Okay, problem number 2. Label the first quadrant of the unit circle to the right and explain what ASTC means and how to use it. So first off, let's go ahead and mark all these degree lines. We know that 0 degrees is equivalent to 0 radians. 30 degrees is equivalent to pi over 6 radians. 45 degrees is equivalent to pi over 4 radians. 60 degrees is equivalent to pi over 3 radians, and then 90 degrees is equivalent to pi over 2 radians. Easy points on here to do are the first and the last. First one has an x value of 1, a y value of 0, because this is the unit circle, meaning the radius is the length of 1 unit. So it's 1, and then straight up and down, same thing, except this time the x value is 0, and the y value represents the radius, because again, this point right here is the origin, 0, 0. So there we have that, and now let's fill in the pieces. Now I remember with the 30, 60, 90 triangle, if you picture this triangle right there, drop that down, there's your right angle. I know that one of these values is 1/2 and the other is the square root of 3 divided by 2. Well, look at these lengths. If you look at that x length is way more than 1/2, whereas if you focus on the y's, that totally is half of that total one. So you can always draw yourself a little reference triangle to try and remember. So that helps remember that the y value there is 1/2, and you need to remember that x corresponds to cosine and y corresponds to sine. So my y value here is going to be 1/2. The x value is going to be the square root of 3 over 2. 45 degrees, pi over 4, is my special point. Those two x values and the x value and the y value are the same. They're both root 2 over 2. I remember that point special because they're both the same, and both numerator and denominator have those 2's in them, and 2 plus 2 is 4 for pi over 4. Thanks, BC, for that one. Okay, well, what about this next point? 60 degrees, aka pi over 3, aka 2 pi over 6, is special because it is the same as the 30-degree triangle, but with the points switched. So now the x value is 1/2, and the y value is the square root of 3 over 2. And there you have it. We're completely done labeling this first quadrant. But what does all students take calculus mean, and how do you use it? Well, what that's saying is, if you think about the whole unit circle there, what it's saying is, if you focus on those quadrants, you can label it. Quadrant 1 is A, quadrant 2 is S, quadrant 3 is T, quadrant 4 is C. What that means is all are positive. Over here, it means that sine is positive, which coincidentally also means that cosecant is positive. T means that tan is positive in this quadrant, and then so is cotan. And C means that cosine is positive, as is secant, because again, the S, T, and C tell you the regular functions, and then you also need to have the same sign on the reciprocal functions. But really, what it's saying is that in that quadrant, in the A quadrant, every single trig function has a positive value. In the second quadrant, only the sine and the cosecant function have positive values. So that means that tangent and cosine and cotan and secant are all negative. In the T quadrant, it means that tan and cotan are positive, but sine, cosecant, cosine, and secant are all negative. In the cosine quadrant, it means cosine and secant are positive, but everything else is negative. That's what it is. That's how you use it. So if I had, for example, the sine of, let's say, 5 pi over 6, well, that is going to be exactly the same as the sine of pi over 6, because 5 pi over 6 is in the second quadrant right there, and sine is positive. But if you think about cosine, so let's say then cosine of 5 pi over 6, that will equal the opposite of cosine of 5. What am I? Pi over 6. Sorry. Cosine of pi over 6. Because cosine is negative in the second quadrant. That's what we're saying. That's how we're using it.